Hello and welcome back to That Age 12. This week I'm joined by Eric H. Cline, that's written 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed, and recently published a sequel after 1177 BC, which I'm also calling up here in the beautiful hardback cover. And let me, so I want to begin with, of course, and by asking, as you do in your first book, and you have hypothesized that we are close to a collapse ourselves in our modern age, and that is, and I mean, looking at the world today, it's kind of not unrealistic to look at it that way. So let's begin to talk about how far away are we from a collapse in our modern world and the modern civilization of today.
Well, thank you for having me on. That's a hard question to answer and a tough one to start with because there's no predicting really, right? I don't know and nobody knows when we're going to collapse or if we're going to collapse. I do think, as I say at the end of most of my lectures, I do think we're heading for a collapse. I can't predict when it's going to take place, but I say that based on the fact that we are more similar than one might think to the societies that were around at the end of the late Bronze Age, and their globalized network did collapse. And since I see many of the same factors around today that they had back then, I know history doesn't repeat per se, but Mark Twain did say that history does rhyme. And so I would say better to be cautious, err on the side of caution, and think that we may well be headed for the collapse. So can't predict it, but I think there's a good chance, and we should take a look at what happened 3,200 years ago and see how they dealt with it and maybe apply it to us today.
And especially with the dependency that we have on the internet and the modern technology that they didn't have back in those days, and collapse, it's if all of this collapse, it's really it would be maybe much worse than what it was back in 1177 BC, because so a lot of people rely on medical equipment or modern technology to survive, or modern hospital equipment. So it would be what can, and you talked a little bit about this in the book as well. What can we do to prepare for such a collapse, as you talk about in the book?
So, in terms of preparation, that's what I end the new sequel with, is suggesting a few common sense things. But as I say in the book, there are things that I would say are so common sense that you don't even have to read the book to come to the same conclusions. But it's things like um, you need redundancy, for example. You need a fallback plan A, and if that doesn't work, you need a plan B. If it doesn't work, you need plan C, plan D, plan D, right? Layers of redundancy, which is what most people would argue for anyway.
So maybe
I,
those doomsday preppers in the United States have a point after all.
Something like that, yeah. But I would also say that um, you need to be prepared for what happens if you do collapse, and how do you bounce back? Are you resilient? Do you transform? Do you adapt? Do you cope? And that's what most of the sequel is about, is looking at the eight societies in antiquity that went through the late Bronze Age collapse and looks at how they dealt with it. And we find that the ones that did the best, like the Phoenicians and the Cypriots, they're the ones that are able to be innovative and inventive and transform and switch from being at the head of copper production to being the lead in the new iron production, to standardize the alphabet and spread those around. I mean, those are the people that really come out well. The ones that were more rigid, shall we say, less flexible, they went down. The Hittites, the economy doesn't survive, the administration doesn't survive. Mycenaeans also don't survive as a society as we
The
know it.
Minoans
So,
as well, I believe.
sorry,
The Minoans.
and the Minoans, exactly, right? They also, both in the case of the Mycenaeans and the Minoans, it's not that everybody dies or migrates. You still have people living there, but the society that we call Minoan or that we call Mycenaean, that doesn't make it past this Bronze Age, Iron Age transition. So it's kind of like a permeable membrane. There's still some stuff from the Bronze Age that makes it through, like the names of the gods and goddesses, right? Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, and all that. But you don't have a Wanox anymore. The Wanox, the king back in the Bronze Age, that term goes away in the Iron Age, and the Basileus takes over. Now, in the Iron Age Greece, you've got the king known as Basileus, but he had been a kind of a more minor government official back in the Bronze Age. So some things yes, some things no. And the one thing that I would say also is keep your eye on water resources, because the ones that did fairly well, or at least made it, were situated on major rivers like the Tigris and the Euphrates. So the Hittites, not so much.
Where they I'm not doing it with the compare. I don't know if it's a far-fetched comparison, but where it collapsed in 1177 BC, kind of like the collapse of Roman Empire, that they didn't really know. They didn't really stop looking at themselves as a Roman until after Romans after 476 BC. Or for to do an example, was it kind of similar that oh civilization collapsed? Okay, we are. This is a disaster. Was it kind of similar as a transition from the Roman Empire to the medieval era, but just much earlier.
I would say it's similar and yet different. Um, It's similar in that for both of the collapses, both the late Bronze Age collapse and the fall and decline of the Roman Empire, you've got a multitude of factors all interplaying, and you can't point to any one factor as the smoking gun that brought everything down, but rather it's the mix, it's the interplay of everything. And that's where it becomes similar, because they're both what Colin Renfrew from Cambridge would have called a systems collapse, right? He came up with this in the late 1970s. And systems collapse, you can't prove to any one smoking gun. You've got a multitude of stressors. It can take up to a century to actually collapse, which is true both for the Roman Empire, right? It took most of the 5th century AD. And even then, it didn't totally collapse. You've still got the Eastern Roman Empire going for another 1,000 years. But same thing with the late Bronze Age, that you have this multitude of factors and you have systems collapse. So I would say there are similarities and yet differences, but we can pull in other ones too. If you're going to be looking at systems collapses, the Maya fall into that. The Harappan civilization in the Indus Valley would be another example of a systems collapse. And then the question is what comes afterward, right? It used to be said that we have a dark age after the Romans went away, and a dark age after the collapse of the Bronze Age. Neither group wants to call it a dark age anymore, right? After Rome in the Middle Ages, you've now got late antiquity, right? And same with us with late Bronze Age. After that, we don't want it to be a dark age. We want it to be the Iron Age. That's what scholars are calling it. But if you look on the internet, it's dark age everywhere and in the textbooks. So we have to do a better job of getting our newer thoughts out there and say, hey, 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 stop calling this a dark age. It's the Iron Age, and we'll go from there. But so yes, again, to answer your question, similarities, yes, but also differences.
And you chose, instead of just focusing on the event of 1177 BC, you choose to focus on the world right before the collapse of 1177 BC. And of course, Egypt is a big part of this. So let's take a world of Egypt and Canaan, and as you do early on in the first book. So let's discuss the world of Egypt before the collapse.
So the role of Egypt before the collapse, it is one of what I call the G8. It's one of the great powers. In fact, Egypt and the Hittites are, I would say, probably the two superpowers of the time. But in this region, I mean, let me make it clear, we're talking about the Mediterranean. We're talking from, in modern terms, from Italy on one side to Iran and Afghanistan on the other, and from Turkey down to Egypt. This, what Susan Sherritt at Sheffield has called the globalized Mediterranean. That's what we're talking about. So, and it really, for all intents and purposes, is from the Mycenaeans onward. So Egypt and the Hittites are, I would say, the two superpowers, followed by Assyria and Babylonia over in Mesopotamia, the Canaanites up and down the Levant, the Cypriots, and Mycenaeans and Minoans. I think that's eight. So the G8. And Egypt is right up there, diplomatically, commercially, militarily, with religion, with government. I mean, you name it, they are up there. They're one of the major players. And we know this obviously from archaeology, but also from the textual records. I mean, we've got quite a good idea of what is going on. And bear in mind that this period, the late Bronze Age that we're talking about, from say 1500 to 1200 BCE, I mean, we're in the Egyptian New Kingdom period. It's the high point. It's the highlight. And indeed, for much of this period, we're in the 18th dynasty with Hatshepsut and Tutmosis III and Amenhotep III and Akhenaten and and of course King Tut, and then Ramses II, Ramses III. I mean, this is actually a period that many general readers know about, but they know it kind of in isolation. They know King Tut, they might know Hatshepsut. They don't realize that this is part of a larger globalized network where everyone's in touch with everyone else. And you have magnificent royal marriages, you've got embassies, you've got embargoes. I mean, as I say in the book, it's much more similar to us today than most people would expect. And Egypt is at the top of the heap.
Where the Egyptian language, sorry, I don't remember what it's called, was that kind of the lingua franca at the time?
So the lingua franca is not Egyptian, but it's Akkadian. That's what they're using, writing in cuneiform, right, wedge-shaped, which is mostly used to write in Mesopotamia. It's Akkadian, Babylonian. You can use cuneiform to write Sumerian. You can use it to write Hittite. It's a writing system. And that writing system then is used for Akkadian, which becomes the diplomatic language, the lingua franca. And that means that in Egypt, you would have had scribes that knew both Egyptian, hieroglyphics and hieratic, but would also know Akkadian and cuneiform. Similarly, up with the Hittites in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, there would have been the scribes that would have known Hittite and Akkadian. Now, if you're living in Mesopotamia, you're lucky. You only have to know Akkadian. But so that's what they're writing in at that time. And that's where things like the Amarna archive that was found in 1887 in Egypt, which is the royal archive of Amenhotep III and Akhenaten. It's all written in Akkadian, even though it's letters to and from the Egyptian pharaohs, right? You would have thought maybe it would have been written in hieroglyphics or hieratic, but no, there are a couple of handwritten notes in ink in hieratic on the tablets, but most of it is, the cuneiform signs impressed into the clay at that time. So pretty much everybody who was anybody that's interacting would have known cuneiform and Akkadian, just like in the days of Ben Franklin, the diplomatic stuff was done in French, right? Same idea.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about trade and trading between empires such as, for example, Babylon or Hittites and the Egyptians, and talk a little bit about how trade in those times and being a merchant before the collapse. And we don't need to talk about this after the collapse as well, but for now, let's keep it
Sure.
in the world before trading before the world of 1177 BC.
Right. So the trading before the collapse is absolutely amazing, especially if you look at like the 14th and 13th centuries BC, where it is so internationalized in this area, so globalized that they are trading both finished products and raw materials, especially metals like gold, silver, copper, tin. And of course, you need copper and tin to make bronze, right? 90% copper, 10% tin. So they're trading the raw materials around. Also, wine, perfume, grain, things like that. But we know, both from textual records and some of the shipwrecks, that they are also sending around things like textiles and shoes. We have one letter from a little bit earlier at Mari. That's one of my favorite textual examples from the 18th century. And Zimri Lim, king of Mari, there's a tablet there that says they imported leather shoes from Crete, from the Minoans, and sent them on to Hammurabi at Babylon, but that Hammurabi sent them back. And they don't say why he sent them back. I've always wondered that. But that's an example of long distance trade of a finished good.
Do we know
And
the time of the distance between, let's
yes,
say, Crete and Babylon, how long time it would take? Because I mean, imagine to try. It wasn't like putting it on a train today or a plane, and you had it in the at the end of the week.
right, exactly. Yeah, that was a long distance to travel, difficult, time consuming, expensive. And so, as I wrote in, and I think I mentioned in the book, but in an earlier article way back when, I discussed the concept of distance value, where an object acquires value, more value than you might have thought inherent simply because of the amount of distance that it travels.
And I
So,
mean,
and
I
you can,
imagine, sorry for interrupting you there, but I imagine it wasn't safe to travel either. You can be robbed quite frequently and suddenly lose everything you have on the way as well. So it wasn't even safe. And of course, this would be true until almost up until early modernity. And so it's early modern world. So it wasn't quite safe to travel on the road either.
right, exactly. It wasn't safe. And we know that again from textual records where they complain that a caravan had been attacked and some of the merchants had been murdered and they want recompense for it. And along those lines, even, I mean, that's on land, on sea, it wasn't safe either because we have the Uluburun shipwreck, for example, which went down in about 1300 BC with an amazing cargo, stuff from 7 different cultures on board. And we've got the Cape Gelidonia shipwreck near to it. So, sailing had its dangers as well. But on land, yeah, we even have one example. We know this again from the text, where the Hittite king sent his son, Prince Zananza, to go down to Egypt to marry the Egyptian queen. But his group is intercepted en route and he's killed. He's assassinated. So, just like today, where people people get robbed in dark alleyways and while traveling down highways and held up, so too it was like back then. So you would probably have been traveling with an armed guard in a caravan, and also be aware that the merchants frequently doubled as diplomats, that they would be carrying goods, but they'd also be carrying messages from the kings. So they did double duty.
Were envoys kind of sacred? Were they if you were robbing an envoy or killing an envoy that went to a different kingdom? How how let's talk about the envoys. If they you were sent as envoy, because that how would that go on? Like if you were an envoy from being sent from Hittites to Egypt, for example, and you were killed, would that what would impact would that have? But
Yeah, so you don't want to kill an envoy, and if the envoy gets killed, there is hell to pay. So, and we see that sometimes in the tablets. Mostly, the envoy is killed, if they are, is killed accidentally while being held up, and we know of the 2 merchants slash diplomats that happens to in Canaan, and the Babylonian king complains to the Egyptian pharaoh that his diplomats and merchants have been killed. So that is problematic. What happened much more frequently, though, is that the diplomats slash merchants would make it from, say, Babylonia to Egypt. They got successfully to the court of the Egyptian king, but would then be detained there and not allowed to go straight back. And we're not just talking months, we're talking years. Like they might stay in Egypt for 3 to 5 years, and eventually, and again, we have this in some of the tablets where the Babylonian king writes and says, could you possibly please send my men back? They've been there for several years. I would like them back. And so then they get sent back. But, usually it's not quite a matter of years that does happen. It's more a matter of months. But I would say and that's not dangerous, it's just inconvenience. But so they are upon occasion killed. More frequently, they are, shall we say, detained
I
and
mean,
only sent back later.
to do a comparison, the Mongols, for example, in their time, envoys were kind of sacred, so they would go full on attack if someone killed an envoy in the Mongol era. It was meant that they'd go on against you, and you would have a bad time. Let's put it that way. If you kill a Mongol envoy, they were
Yes.
kind of sacred in in that time as well. But I wanted to talk. You mentioned the sea, and of course, traded from Crete to Egypt. What was there worry about piracy as well in those
There
days?
is, that's hard to determine archaeologically unless it's mentioned in texts. So, yes, there was piracy at that time, undoubtedly. There is a group known as the Luca who formed part of the Sea Peoples who lived in what is later Lycia in, southwestern Anatolia, and they were known for being pirates. So, and then of course you have others like, remember the later Cilician pirates that captured Julius Caesar and held him for ransom. So you do have piracy all in this area for, over the centuries, that's for sure. So we can't discount that as well. We do know, again, from textual records that there are so-called enemy ships that are spied from time to time that one king warns another of, and we have letters like that at the site of Ugarit on the north coast of what is now Syria, where we have letters from the governor or the king of Cyprus saying to the king at Ugarit, by the way, 20 more enemy ships have been spotted. And, whether they're pirates or migrants or mercenaries or whatever is not told. They're simply called the enemy. But yes, I think piracy, and some of my colleagues, especially Aaron Meyer and Louise Hitchcock, have made pretty good argument for piracy being part of the general problems at the end of the late Bronze Age and perhaps contributing to the collapse in the 12th century.
Of course, wars has been a plague since the dawn of civilization, and of course, the era before 1177 BC was no different. And of course, you write a little bit about the Egyptian and Canaan battle of Megiddo. Sorry if I say that wrong. So
Yes.
let's talk a little bit about this, but the battles that took place, because
Yeah, so
not
some of the
every civilization got along and in that time either.
Yes, absolutely. So this is where the Hittites and the Egyptians fight, but they're also the people in the middle get involved. So the Battle of Megiddo, as you mentioned, which is I date it to like 1479, beginning of the 15th century. That's the Egyptians and the local Canaanites who had risen up in rebellion during the first year of Tutmosis III's reign. And there are something like, if I remember correctly, 30 rebel Canaanite kings that have gathered together at Megiddo, which is, of course, also known today as Biblical Armageddon. That's where the word Armageddon comes from. Har Megiddo means the mound or mountain of Megiddo. And from Har Megiddo, you get Harmageddon, and from Harmageddon, you get Armageddon. So, but that's later, New Testament. Back then, it's just Megiddo. And yes, you have rebellious Canaanites, and the Egyptians have to put them down, which they do. And what's interesting about that battle at Megiddo is not only that the Egyptians won, but that Tutmosis III recorded it on the walls of his various temples down in Egypt. And so we know it as the first battle in history. I mean, of course, it's not the first battle in history. That's
Mm.
been going on since Neolithic people threw rocks at each other. But it's the first one that's actually written down. And it looks like his generals or somebody, a scribe with the army, kept a daily journal. And then at the end, he recorded the overviews of what happened, including the tactics of what he used to capture Megiddo, which he does. So the Battle of Megiddo, very famous, but we have other ones too. I'll just give you one other example.
Of
About
course.
200 years later, about 1279, major battle between the Egyptians and the Hittites. over who's going to control Canaan at that time. And that's fought a little bit further north of Megiddo at Kadesh. The Battle of Kadesh is Hittites versus Egyptians. It turns out it's a stalemate, it's a draw, but both sides claim they won, which is so typical, right? No, I won.
Where
No,
have we
you
seen
won.
that
No,
before?
exactly. We've definitely. But the interesting thing is that they signed a treaty after that, and in fact, there's a royal marriage that's arranged to kind of cement the treaty. We have a number of different copies of it, and I believe I may be wrong about this, but I think one of the copies is at the United Nations in New York, in a wall somewhere, so people can look at it. So it winds up with one of the first peace treaties that we've got. But that battle at Kadesh is also one of the first examples we know of deliberate misinformation,
Mm.
because the Hittites sent out two spies to go look, where are the Egyptians? Where's the army? And they had told the spies, when you get back, we won't be here because we're going back to
So
Anatolia.
Trump did
So
not invent fake news then.
they did. They invented fake news.
Mm.
Yes. So they had told the spies, when you come back with your report, you're going to have to catch up with us. Well, they sent the two spies down into an area where they knew they would be captured. And so when the Egyptians captured the spies and I presume tortured them and got the information out of them, the two Hittite spies says the army has left. They've gone back to Anatolia. And so the Egyptians started, double pacing. Let's go after them. We've got them on the retreat. In actuality, the Hittites hadn't left at all. They were just hiding behind the city. And as the Egyptians went roaring by, the Hittites came out and attacked them from the rear and almost won the day just like that. So that to me is fascinating. That's one of the,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, it's fake news
Mm.
and deliberate misinformation.
Mm. I want to talk about another group as well, and that is the Israelites. And I had Aidan Dodson on the Egyptologist a few times, and we
Hmm.
talked about this. And he mentioned that the Israelites were actually more or less thrown out in Egypt instead of chased out. What is your thoughts on this? That the Israelites were kind of thrown out as instead of what they do say in the Bible of Moses, they were chased out of Egypt and had wandered the desert for 40 years.
Well, I would say yes, that's a possibility. The problem is that we honestly don't know what happened, right? Archaeologically, we haven't yet found any real evidence for the Exodus taking place. We're still looking for it, but there's all kinds of theories and hypotheses out there, ranging from that it had already taken place quite a few hundred years earlier, like 1450 BC, and that the Israelites were already up in Canaan in the highlands. Others saying that they were up in the highlands of Canaan the whole time, that they're actually Canaanites, and so on. There's all kinds of hypotheses that are out there. What I'm wondering is whether the collapse may have allowed the Israelites to enter the land or to come down from the highlands or whatever. Because in the collapse, in the decades, say after 1200, after 1177 BC, the Egyptians pull out of the region. The Egyptians leave Canaan by 1140 BCE at the latest. And the Canaanite cities, they're in smoking ruins, right? Megiddo is attacked, Hatzor, Jerusalem, excuse me, they're all attacked, they're all in flames. And so one thing that I suggested is that that might be the context for the Exodus and the so-called Israelite conquest of Canaan is in the immediate aftermath of the collapse. To me, that makes perfect sense because otherwise, I don't know how the Israelites would have taken on the Canaanites. The Canaanites were pretty powerful. But if the Canaanites have already been destroyed to a certain extent by sea peoples and drought and famine and earthquakes, then the Israelites might have actually been fairly resilient and been able to transform and take advantage of the chaos. But it really depends. It's a house of cards here. It depends when you think the Exodus took place, if you think the Exodus took place. It depends how, when, and why the Israelite conquest of Canaan took place. I mean, there's all kinds of things. So, to say that they're pushed out of Egypt rather than left voluntarily is just another possibility, is what I would say. There's a lot more work that needs to be done here, including we need more archaeological discoveries and so on. But, in part, that's why this makes this such an interesting period of history, is
Mm.
because there still are mysteries to be resolved.
Almost 4,000 years later, and it's really interesting how we're just beginning to decipher all of these texts, and how we until now we just kind of relied on biblical as well. So it's really interesting how just recently we are able to finally get a somewhat understanding of what is finally happened.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Exactly. And every time somebody goes out and excavates and finds something new, we have to revise our knowledge and adjust, readjust, which is great.
It's really incredible how archaeology has changed our history and has confirmed and how things, are actually had us confirm or disputed things that we have up to now
Mm-hmm.
maybe believe were real. Or, for example, the one example, the Battle of Teutoburg Forest has been confirmed as a real event when you found the
Mm-hmm.
rotation by a happy accident. Times the archaeology, or and archaeology is a fairly new profession as well, only from the 19th century. So it's really incredible how all these things finally are able, almost 3,000 years later, like I said, are able to come to light.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I also want to use them in combination or in juxtaposition. I tell my students and my audiences that I'm a bit of a skeptic, shall we say, and I won't 100% believe anything, say,
Mm.
from antiquity for sure, unless there are three independent sources that
Yeah,
corroborate it. So, if we have, say, the account in the Hebrew Bible and an account in the Neo-Assyrian inscription, and we've got archaeology, okay, now we're on, pretty firm ground. So, like the Neo-Assyrians attacking the northern kingdom of Israel in about 720 BCE. We've got the description in the Hebrew Bible of what's happening at about that time, but we've also got the inscriptions from the Neo-Assyrian kings. And then we have the archaeology from, say, when the ruins at Samaria were excavated. And so there, I'm like, okay, good. We're on
yeah.
firm ground there. Yeah.
Uh, so we spoke a little bit about the world before 1177 BC, and now it's time to begin to talk about the collapse and year 1177 BC. And before we do that, how have we come to the conclusion that it was 1177 BC that we went from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, and that's the year that civilization has indeed collapsed?
Well, I would say, first of all, let's back up two steps because that is misleading. The 1177, and by the way, I fought with my publisher for years about this. 1177 BC is not the year civilization collapsed. It is a year during the collapse of the civilizations. What it is, it's the second time the Sea Peoples invade Egypt. They invade 30 years earlier in 1207 BC under the time of Pharaoh Merneptah, who beats them. And they invade again in 1177 BC when they are beaten by Ramses III. And these are, of course, 9 different groups of people that are united, and we call them the Sea Peoples. So, 1177 is the second time that they attacked. Now, what I wanted to call it basically was life was different in 1200 BC
Mm.
compared to 1100 compared to 1000, right? But,
Maybe not as
that's,
catchy, but
yeah, yeah, right. And
yeah.
so Right. So what my editor said, and he was quite right. He's like, look, we need to use shorthand. And 1177 is a short and catchy title.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that I explain it in the book is that just, and we were talking about the fall of the Roman Empire earlier, when over here in the United States, when we teach this to our fifth graders or 10th graders in high school, we frequently say that Rome fell in 476
Yeah.
AD. That's just the date, right?
Mm.
Of course, it didn't fall that year. We know that very well. And since the fall of Rome
I
was the
didn't go,
system,
oh, we're Italian now. We speak Italian.
yeah, they're not going to do that, right? Just like in 1176, they're not going to say, okay, we're using iron now,
Yeah.
right? Bronze is so last year, right? So 476 is shorthand for the collapse of the Roman Empire.
Mm.
1177 is shorthand for the late Bronze Age collapse. And I'll be the first to say, yeah, it actually took most of the 12th century in order to do that. So that's what happened, though, in 1177. And for me, again, talking to both colleagues and students and general audiences, the advantage now is that, and you see this all over the internet, is that people say, oh my God, life was terrible in 1177. I'm like, yeah, it was, but not just that year. So I would expand it out from that, if that makes sense.
So
So,
hmm. Let's talk about, you mentioned the sea people, and let's talk about them because, like you said in your book, nobody really knows where they came from. Then we don't know if they came from Europe or where, or if they came from, like, say, Anatolia or wherever they came from. Nobody really knows who they exactly they were. And why do we know so little about them, and what and how did they come to get the name Sea People? And let's talk about the, like you said, it wasn't just in 1177 BC that they made it. So let's talk
right.
a little bit about the Sea Peoples and their innovation of the civilization.
So the problem is that they themselves do not leave any written records. They themselves do not necessarily leave much in the way of archaeological remains. We know about them because other people talk about them. So, for example, the inscriptions that I've been mentioning, Ramses III, when he defeats the Sea Peoples in 1177, puts the account up on the walls of temples, especially his own mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. So just like Tutmosis III had recorded the details of the Battle of Megiddo, so too Ramses III records the details of the battles against the Sea Peoples. Merneptah did the same thing as well. If we did not have the inscriptions of Ramses or Merneptah, we might not know that there had been any groups such as the Sea Peoples. So the way it comes about, it was early French Egyptologists that were reading these inscriptions and realized that there were a number of groups that came in 1207 during Merneptah's reign, and a number of other groups that came 30 years later in Ramses III's reign. And there was some overlap between the two groups. Some groups came both times, such that there are a total of 9 different groups that came in either one or the other or both of the invasions. And the French said, okay, they come from the sea. That's what the Egyptians say. The northerners from all lands, they came from their islands in the
It's
midst
always
of
the
the sea.
Northerners in it.
Yes, exactly. Right. And so the French simply called them the Sea Peoples, and it stuck. But we actually have the names of the individual groups. So we've got, for instance, one group is known as the Shurden or the Shardana, and people have suggested that they might have come from Sardinia because the names sound familiar, similar. They may not. Another group, the Shekelesh, sounds like they could come from Sicily. The upshot, though, is we really don't know. Nobody has ever found a site and pointed to it and says that's where one of the Sea Peoples came from. We've never been able to do that yet. The one group that we think we can identify, and we've always thought, is the group known as the Peleset. And the Peleset, we think, are the Philistines. And them, we've also been able to identify Philistine pottery and Philistine remains, mostly in the Levant, the southern Levant. And of course, we know the Philistines from the Bible also. right? And so we're able to link those up. We also have a couple of mentions like Tel Dor, which is now in the north of modern day Israel. They one of the records, the Tale of Wenamun, says that that was a Tejeker city, and the Tejeker, with a TJ at the beginning, they're one of the groups of the Sea Peoples. And Ramses himself says that when he beat the Sea Peoples, he says, quote, I settled them in strongholds bound in my name, meaning that he settled them in Egypt and in Canaan, which Egypt controlled. So we know where the Sea Peoples ended up, even if we don't know where they came from. But the other thing, and this will be my last point, we also don't know if the picture that we have of them is actually accurate. When I was an undergraduate and in graduate school, it was taught to me that they alone ended the late Bronze Age, that they were this boogeyman that, caused all kinds of strife and chaos. Now our thinking has, I would say, mellowed a little bit, and we're thinking that maybe they weren't just hardcore invaders, maybe they were migrants, refugees in search of a better life, in which case they're not just oppressors, but they're victims as well. And that, I think, some of that can resonate today. We have so many migrants, we have so many refugees fleeing, right, that we can see some similarities again between us today and them back then. So, but the Sea Peoples remain another one of these history's mysteries.
Again, we talked about archaeology earlier. Do we have any archaeological evidence, or where we might any idea where we might search for archaeological evidence for to look for where the sea people might have originated, or any in Egypt or wherever they might have went, that we can look for evidence to have a clue where they come from?
Yeah, so we can try, and people have been looking. I would personally suggest that people keep looking as they have been over in the Western Mediterranean. Look on Sardinia and the Nuragic culture there. Look on Sicily. Look in northern Italy. And we do know for a fact now, some of the new research, there was a drought that hit northern Italy along with everywhere else. But northern Italy, some of the archaeologists there are thinking that thousands of people may have migrated because of that drought. And those could be the origin of the Sea Peoples. But we're getting data from other places that one might not necessarily expect. Namely, for instance, in the Philistine burials at the site of Ashkelon in what is now southern Israel. A couple of infants were excavated a couple of years ago, and their DNA was studied. And it turns out that these infants, who are from a little bit later in the 12th century, early 11th century, their grandparents, at least one of them was a Philistine, because they've got Canaanite DNA, but they've also got other. And if you run the other for the DNA through the computer models, it says most likely that that grandparent was from Crete or Spain or Sicily. And so there is an example where you have a burial that you know is Philistine over in the Eastern Mediterranean, and they're telling you that that person is descended from somebody who came from either the Aegean or the Western Mediterranean. So that's going to be another way that we can perhaps try to figure out where the Sea Peoples came from originally, is through genetics and computer modeling.
And of course, another thing, and we spoke about this another episode on ancient Greece few weeks ago, and we spoke about this early Greek civilization. And one thing that I think we spoke about how this has been disputed in recent years, that the so-called Dorian invasion, and how, and you mentioned this as well. So let's discuss this so-called Dorian invasion that up until fairly recently, I think people actually believe happened. Who were the Dorians, and what? Why do we think that this invasion did not happen until
So,
recently?
okay, so the Dorians are mentioned by later Greek historians like Herodotus and Thucydides, and they talk about a Dorian invasion in the wake of the Trojan War, like 80 years afterward. And in part, what they're doing by invoking a so-called Dorian invasion is trying to explain why there were different dialects of Greek, right? The Spartans, I mean, it's a dialect, it's an accent. The Spartans spoke slightly different, right, Doric Greek than the Athenians who were doing, Attic or Ionian Greek, something like that. So they're trying to figure out why people are speaking different strands, different dialects, and they invoke the Dorian invasion. The problem is, and it actually already started back in the 60s, that archaeologists were looking for evidence of the Dorian invasion, and they can't find any. The things that we had thought were evidence of an invasion turns out not to be. So, for example, the fibulae type of pin turns out it's not new in the aftermath of the collapse in the early Iron Age. It actually goes back into the Bronze Age. Similarly, there's a type of sword, the Nawa II sword, which we thought was new in the Iron Age. Nope, it goes back to the Bronze Age, and so on and so forth. So, roundabout in the mid 60s, scholars started to question this, and it got more and more intense. And people are calling it now a mirage. They're calling it the migration that, didn't happen, the invisible migration. The upshot is that most scholars, and if you read the scholarly works, they will now say there is no such thing. It never happened. It was a figment of imagination. And that's how I begin this new book, the sequel. Just like in the original, I started out, the very first part of the book is about the coming of the Sea Peoples. So too, the first page or so of this new book is the so-called Dorian invasion. And I go through a scenario that used to be taught, of these invaders coming down. And then I simply say in one sentence, the only problem is it probably never happened. We don't have any evidence for it whatsoever, nor do you need it. In fact, what I think probably happened is, again, like the Sea Peoples, not an invasion, but a migration. And so these people either coming from the north of Greece down into Greece, though again, we don't see much evidence for that, more likely moving around within Greece itself. And they're migrating. And I know it doesn't sound like a huge difference, an invasion versus a migration, but it's more than just semantics. It's a huge
And sorry for
difference.
interrupting you again, but again, to take a look at the Roman Empire as an example to this, they as well, it wasn't an invasion per se. It was that and the gods, they were Christian as well. They wanted to migrate into the Roman world because it was a better place, and so it
Hmm.
wasn't really an invasion of the Roman
Right.
Empire as well. It was a migration. So it could, like you say, it could be the same case in
Hmm.
1177 BC. That was a migration crisis. I mean, again, we
Yeah.
discussed this in our ancient Greek episode as well, that it could be a case of migration crisis.
Hmm. Exactly. I would say exactly. Right. And so, but the other thing is we don't need the Dorian invasion to explain things. We can explain everything perfectly fine without it. But here again, it's just like Dark Ages versus Iron Ages. If you go on to Google and you type in Dorian invasion, up will come all sorts of websites and everything that talk about the Dorian invasion, including, as I point out in the book, online encyclopedias and textbooks that still talk about the Dorian invasion, even though the scholars don't think it happened. So some of my colleagues have said, again, we need to do a better job to get our information and our current thinking out into the realm of general common knowledge. And people need to stop talking about the Dorian invasion because, as far as we can tell from archaeology, there was no such thing.
Mm. Of course, I mean, don't run up, so I know we're done running out of time now, but I wanted to talk a little bit about your sequel as well after 1177 BC. And let's talk a little bit about the aftermath of the
Mhm.
collapse of civilization. And again, we spoke about this early on, where they were they aware that there was a collapse? Were they like, oh, civilization ended, what do we do now? Or were they like, okay, let's just life moves on, and were they aware back then?
Right.
I think again to the comparison is back in the first few minutes of this episode that how a collapse could be. I think we've been much more aware of a collapse
Hmm.
in our days and
Yes.
age, but were they aware that it was like what we call a collapse in today's history world? Were they aware that there was a collapse, and how did they move on? And it was mentioned how people adapted from that in after 1177 BC. So let's talk a little bit about the aftermath and how life went on even after the collapse of civilization.
Right. So first things first, I do not think that for the most part they were aware that everything was collapsing, right? They don't write about it. They don't say like we don't see Minoans anymore. We don't say, oh my word, Ugarit was overrun. We don't have any like eyewitness contemporary accounts that say that. All we have are things that we can make inferences from. So, for instance, there's a recent study showing that the Egyptians were crossbreeding cattle in the early 12th century, regular cattle with zebu or zebu cattle that are better in arid climates, and that they were overplanting for grain in Canaan, which indicates that there was drought, but also that they knew they had to, plant more grain. But they don't say anything like it. Instead, what we have are textual references. Please for help, if you will. The Hittite king saying, there's famine in my land. Please help. It's a matter of life and death. We've got the king of Ugarit writing to the Pharaoh of Egypt saying, here in my city, there's famine. Please send grain, right? But he doesn't say everything's collapsing. He just says there's a drought and famine.
And
So
I know I don't have a few comparisons in this episode, and I'm sorry for interrupting again, but it's kind of like after World War, sounds like it was after World War II, where Egypt was kind of the Marshall Plan after 1177 to BC, where like US had that aid to countries devastated by the Second World War, and kind of seemed like the same in that Egypt was kind of like a Marshall Plan in a way to other civilizations. If that's a good comparison, or is there something to this?
it is, but only for a while. Egypt is trying to help the others until they themselves go down also. Because in the grand scheme of things, Egypt does not do that well. In the sequel, I rank the different societies, and I already mentioned, for example, that the Phoenicians
Hmm.
and the Cypriots do the best, and the Assyrians and the Babylonians do okay, but not great. The Egyptians simply cope. Uh, we get the third intermediate period in Egypt, which is a period of anarchy and unrest. We have one example where there are at least three, if not four, different people all claiming that they are the Pharaoh of Egypt, ruling in different parts of the country. And Egypt definitely withdraws from the international scene in these centuries after the collapse. So they did try at first to help the others, but then they're too consumed with their own problems and they kind of withdraw, as I say, from the international scene. And then, but they don't do as badly as others. Mycenaeans and Minoans do worse,
Hmm.
and the Hittites do almost the worst of all. So, but again, I come back to, and I mentioned this in the book, there is nobody recording for posterity back then. There is nobody saying, we are collapsing. We had an earthquake last week, and then invaders showed up, and nobody can eat because there's a famine. Nothing like that. We are solely working from mostly archaeological remains, but more and more hard science. So, for example, we know that there is a drought at that time, which lasted as much as 300 years in some places, certainly 150 years in others. And we're getting that information through studying the ancient pollen, through studying the lake sediments at the bottom of a lake, through stalagmites in caves that dried up and stopped growing because there was so little water. And so we're coming at it through proxies. That's probably the best way to call it. Through proxies, we can figure out that there was a drought because of what we can see in the pollen record and so on. But again, we do have some text where it says, like I mentioned, enemy ships have been spotted, watch out. And then we see from archaeology that the city of Ugarit was burnt to the ground and with arrowheads in the walls and not reoccupied for like 400 years. But all they say is the enemy is approaching. They don't tell us who the enemy is. So, it's very tantalizing. But again, it's kind of like the beauty of archaeology and ancient history. We have an incomplete jigsaw puzzle, if you will. We're missing like more than half the pieces, and we don't have a picture of the original puzzle to know what we're supposed to reconstruct. But some of the pieces we can actually fit together, and others we know approximately where they go, but we don't have the big picture overall yet. So, but I would say, and I'll end with this here, I would agree with you that we are more aware today of our problems and of the potential for collapse than they were back then, right? They had no idea. And they didn't know what caused drought, and they didn't know how to overcome it. We at least have a better idea of how to deal with things like climate change, which they would have had, no idea about. So we're in a better position, but only if we pay attention to it. If we ignore the symptoms and the stressors that I see around us today, then we're going to be in trouble.
As
And
certain
somebody,
politicians choose to do.
yeah, but there's going to be somebody, if we don't do something about it, there's going to be somebody talking like we are, but 2, 3, 4,000 years in the future going, yeah, that civilization,
Mm.
USA,
Uh,
they're like, yeah, what happened to them? Oh, they didn't pay attention to what was
I
happening.
thought that
I,
guy Donald Trump got elected and everything else went down. Yeah.
right, we could see something like
I,
that. Yeah, yeah.
I actually want to talk about this when you mentioned the term dark age, and I had a few months ago the brilliant Brian Ward Perkins room to discuss the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and we speak about the term dark age because it
Hmm.
was mainly called the dark age because there were no written records or there were no that's kind of why they chose to call it the Dark Age. So is it kind of fair to call it the Dark Age? Maybe because there was no written records that even so much like you said, even after 1177 BC as well, that there were because we have no written records or that we know of that it's and that's kind of a fair ground to call it the dark age. Not that it was the dark world and kind of like everything
Well,
was bad, kind of like most people could probably imagine the early medieval era to be, or right after the fall of the Roman Empire. But again, sorry for doing so many comparisons here, but is it fair to kind of call it a dark age because the lack of written sources?
no, it is not. It was, but that's only one aspect. And in the sequel, I give a couple of general things that you need to have a dark age. And yes, lack of written records is one, but also things like you don't remember how to put up monumental buildings anymore. You don't have a centralized economy per se. You're all split up. You've gone to a lower socio-political economic level. And to a certain degree, that is true in various places in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean in the centuries after the collapse. But it really depends on where you look. Because, for example, if you look at Assyria and Babylonia, they don't lose the art of writing. They're still writing the entire time. They've still got royal inscriptions. They're still building large buildings. They've still got their government, their economy, their religion. There's no dark age in Mesopotamia, in Assyria and Babylon. I would also say there's no dark age in Egypt, right? And even in Greece and in Anatolia, where there is, it looks like, a fair amount of loss of life or migration, and we do lose the economy and the administration and all that.
And again, as that's kind of why people choose to start with Homer, the world of Age of Homer, because you have no written record before, kind of before Homer, right? Before, and that's really
Well,
the first kind of written records begin to appear in the Greek civilization, and that's why
but you're
most people start begin in the world of Homer when they talk about antiquity.
right. Well, so the Dark Ages per se, as you imply, is mostly applied to Greece.
Hmm.
And that is because after the late Bronze Age, the collapse, they don't use linear B anymore, which had been the writing system for the palaces. So they don't need that anymore if the palaces are gone. The question is, at what point did the alphabet come over? And it is frequently said, and still thought by many people, that it doesn't come over until the 8th century. And you've got, then Homer, Hesiod, on to
Not
Sappho,
Homer Simpson.
right? And we go on from there. But um, some archaeologists and philologists are moving the date back, such that there's even one that says, I mean, we know the Phoenicians bring the alphabet over, they standardize it and they bring it over. It's now been suggested by some that it comes over to Greece as early as the 11th century, which means if Linear B goes away at the beginning of the 12th century, and you've got the alphabet there by the 11th century, that's only, 100 years. In which case, there goes your Dark Ages. There's only
Mhm.
just a couple of decades that they're not writing. And I'm kind of in favor of that because there is some evidence that there are like 30 something variations of the Greek alphabet in Greece before they settle on the one that everybody uses by the 8th century. So, but don't forget also, this is an age of innovation. This is when we turn from bronze to iron. This is also when we turn from linear B to the alphabet. So some of my colleagues are not only arguing that this is not a dark age, which I think makes sense, that it's an age of invention, but they're also pointing out that the ancient Greeks themselves never talk about a dark age. They might talk about the Dornian invasion, but they never talk about a dark age. And I say in the sequel, I quote, the dark ages are our invention. The Greeks never talked about a dark age. So why should we? Well, in part, it was because we knew so little about that period. But now we know a fair amount. In fact, Chester Starr, who was a historian at University of Michigan, at one point he said there is no other period in Greek history that we have learned so much so quickly as the Iron Age. So that's what I say at the end. I join the chorus of my colleagues saying, look, we used to think it's a dark age, and in part that was our problem. And then we published a bunch of articles saying, new light shed on the dark age, ha ha ha, scholarly joke. Um, Now it's not a dark age anymore. So let's call it the Iron Age. So again, just like the later people after the fall of Rome, they're like, don't call us a dark age, we're late antiquity. So now we're like, don't call us a dark age, we're the Iron Age, and we go from there. But again, let me hasten to point out, it depends where you look, right? In Greece, yeah, they're hit harder and they go down more than, say, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and certainly more than the Central Canaanites who pivot and become the Phoenicians. So it really depends on where you look and when you look during this period.
Hmm. I think we're gonna run it up there. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you today. Of course, before you go, where can people buy your books?
You,
1177 BC and after 1177 BC. And I do believe you have a book tour as well with publishing. So where can people
yep,
find you if on your book tour if they are interested? And of course, do you have any links or social media where people might find you or other things you want to promote on the
right.
podcast today?
So you can find me on most social media as Dig Cabri, which is the name of my dig, but just search for my name and you can find me. In terms of the books, though, there's also the graphic version. There's now kind of a comic book version of the original, which is absolutely
That's
amazing.
cool.
Yeah, drawn by Glynis Fox, which is amazing. So you can get them all either just by going on Amazon or by going directly on the website to Princeton University Press, and you can get them all there. So, but there are also a number of translations that are available, both of the original. I think it's been in 16 languages, and the sequel is now going to come out, I think, in about 11 different languages so far. So, if you
Impressive.
want to wait for German or French or Italian or Spanish, it will be out eventually. But for now, the English go to either Amazon or go directly to Princeton University Press.
Thank you again for coming on. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you today. This has been With That Age 12. We are available on social media and With That Age 12 on Twitter/X, whatever you want to call it these days. Instagram, With That Age 12. YouTube, you can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, wherever you are can find podcasts these days. If you are Spotify, consider giving us 5 stars. It would be nice. Or you can give us 1 star. It's a free world, at least in this part of the world. And or if you are an Apple Podcast, consider writing a review, and I will try to read it out for you on this podcast. Thank you again for coming on. This has been With That Age 12. And my name is Alan, and I'll see you next time.